Norwegian, norsk, bokmål, book language, an introductory overview. This is a text from a novel by Sigrid Undset, one of Norway's most famous novelists, and it's written in a form of the language that has various names. It's been known as Danish Norwegian, book language, the national language, and it's certainly a form of the language that's more common than the form Nynorsk that we looked at last time. I want to reverse my process. Usually I think the most important thing I do in these introductory overviews is give you a word-by-word translation, and I hope I get to that, but last time I only did that, and I didn't give you any history. So what you need to know is, why does Norway doesn't have two different languages at all? It has two different orthographies, two different official ways of writing down the same language. Why is that? It came to pass in this way. There was a common Scandinavian language until about 800 AD, and it divided into West and East at that point. And we've looked at West Scandinavian in Icelandic and Faroese, and we're going to look at East Scandinavian in Danish and Swedish. And now in the Norwegian situation, it's complicated. From 1370 until 1814, Norway and Denmark were one kingdom, the capital being in Copenhagen, Denmark being the stronger party. And so throughout those 400 years, Norwegians spoke their own regional dialectical form of the vernacular spoken language, but they wrote down Danish, and they're still in the habit of doing that. And in the 19th century, in the spirit of Romanticism, in the spirit of nationalism, and in the spirit of comparative philology, a scholar named Ivar Aasen looked at this situation and said, "Now, why should we, as West Norwegian speakers, West Scandinavian speakers, be writing down an East Scandinavian language?" So he came up with the orthography that we looked at last time of Nynorsk by going into particularly the West Scandinavian dialects and giving them sort of a standardization. Whereas the form that we're looking at today is over here. Bokmål starts its sort of independent life in 1907, when there were a set of spelling reforms that marked it off somewhat from Danish, and there have been further spelling reforms, 1917, 1938, but they're still quite intelligible. Here's another chart that shows the situation between the continental Scandinavian languages as a triangle, with the hypotenuse between Danish and Swedish, and between Danish and Norwegian there being a shorter line of a lexicon, and Norwegian and Swedish a shorter line of phonology, with a description that when Norwegians and Swedes communicate orally, they can tell what word is being spoken, though they may be uncertain of its meaning. When Norwegians and Danes communicate, they have to listen hard to be sure which word the other is using, but once they get that, they usually know what it means. Or, as one wit has put it, Norwegian is Danish spoken in Swedish. So, with that kind of background, let's look at some maps that are in these two books that I picked up last time I was in Norway, Norwegian for Danes and Norwegian for Swedes. They certainly don't need to study Norwegian to understand it, either of these speakers, but there are some things they need to do. Let's look at that first and foremost. The word list that from that triangle we just looked at here, each book gives about 500, 600 words that are problematic for speakers, and it's interesting the difference. In the Norwegian for Swedish speakers, they need to give a dual column of words that are the same in both languages, false friends as it were, but have different meanings. For example, there's the word anledning in Norwegian means tillfälle or circumstance in Swedish, whereas anledning in Swedish means grunn or orsak in Norwegian, means ground or origin or reason. So you can see you could get into trouble with some of these false friends, whereas in the Norwegian for Danish book, what they need to give in that word list are not false friends of words that sound the same but have the different meaning, but words that are different in Norwegian, words that are not used in Danish over here. So a Dane needing to need Norwegian needs to learn some new words that would be dialectical to him, I suppose. Speaking of dialects, here's a dialect chart of Norway, and that's significant. Shows that there are 4 major dialects in Norway: East Norwegian, North, West, and this is mainly what became Nynorsk. And Nynorsk, the maps that we looked at last time, showed a chart of just where they were spoken today. Here's a chart that shows 1945 versus 1990, and you can see the darker areas are where Nynorsk is favored, and you can see it's kind of I would have to say in retreat. Back in the 1940s and 50s is when it had its heyday and was used by about maybe 30% of the people in Norway for writing down, whereas today it's something in the order of 17 or 18%. So if you were to find a text in Norwegian. This is Nynorsk again, and by most accounts it does give a somewhat better representation of the actual spoken language, but those dialects that we saw are in Norway, there's less of a stigma attached to speaking a local dialect than there is in a lot of other languages, and so Nynorsk might be a better representation of the way most Norwegians speak, but most Norwegians do write things down more in this fashion, again, Dano-Norwegian style of writing. How can you tell them apart? Well, this is where it's very difficult because they are two different forms of the same language. Until now, I've been able to point to special letters or other orthographic differences that you could sort of look at it with a glance and tell certain Germanic languages apart. We don't have that anymore. These are the same language. You really have a hard time telling them apart unless you can read them and understand them. So if you're a hapless library assistant and you need to catalog a book that you get from Norway and you need to know if it's Nynorsk or Bokmål, you're going to have a hard time. You have to kind of go into it and do some comparison. I would say the easiest way to tell them apart is to learn to look for the indefinite articles, and in the sort of standard Norwegian, more common Norwegian, you only have them written here as this is a masculine or common in, and here we have ein. Okay, so you have the EI diphthong being more common with the indefinite article in Nynorsk versus just a plain E in the Norsk Bokmål. Likewise, you have a few more J inserts. Let's find the same word on both pages. Here's ikke, not, and ikke in Nynorsk, written with a J insert. If I had chosen my text better, I would have gotten some question words and found that they begin with a K in Nynorsk, whereas with an H in Bokmål. Let me read this text quickly and translate as much as I can just to get an idea of what's going on. Det var ikke så mørkt inne i skogen da det hadde vennet seg litt til det. Himmelen lyste svakt over grantuppene, og elven speilte den og skinte blankt gjennom årekattet langs veien. Det luktet kaldt og vårlig der inne. Av våt jord og nytt gress og trær som svedet ut sedje av alle det unge skudd. Det stod et øyeblikk og så nedover veien, da den løp videre inn i skogen igjen. Det var en underlig, utydelig lyd i luften, høyt oppe over deres høyder. Fugletrekk så torkild. Det stod der med armene om hverandre, og så opp i den grålyse, skyede himmel, hvor det ingenting kunne skjelne. Og mens han holdt henne inntil seg, forsøkte han å være jevn og stille i stemmen, da han sa, ja, sov dere hjemme da? There was not so dark inside in the woods when they had accustomed themselves a little to that. The sky was shone weakly over the tops of the pine trees, and the river reflected them and shone brightly among the alder trees along the way. There, it smelled cold and spring-like therein, of wet earth, and I'm going to get cut off, I'll just keep going until I do, and new grass, and trees which